the Ukrainians have got to conjure out of this offensive, not just military success, but some sense of a decisive shift in the perception of what is going on the battlefield, so that both Ukraine and Russia and the rest of the Western world have a sense that this war could result in the Russians being thrown out of Ukrainian territory in some reasonable time, maybe end of this year, maybe in this time next year.
Seems to be so much uncertainty about the war in Ukraine at the moment. We can't seem to even say for sure what is happening in the city of Bakhmut. The Russians say they have taken it. The Ukrainians say they haven't quite. Lots of controversy about a place that doesn't even seem to be that strategically important, and there isn't much left of anyway. Let's try and blow away some of the fog of war with Professor Michael Clarke, the former Director General of RUSI. Good morning to you, Michael.
Yeah, good morning.
Do we have a sense of what's going on in Bakhmut now, do you think? Is it fair to say that the Russians, they've been bombing it for ages, they have control over the centre of it? Can we agree on that, do you think?
Yes, we can. Yeah, the Russians have taken it. They've taken the urban centre after over a year. The first artillery shells fell on Bakhmut on the 17th of May last year. So we're just over the annual anniversary when the Russians began to operate against Bakhmut. And about a week ago, they more or less pushed the Ukrainians out of the very southwest tip of Bakhmut. They got hold of the high ground on the northwest tip of the urban area, which has got some of the high buildings in it, which gives them observations, so they could see where the Ukrainians were. And the Ukrainians always knew that if the Russians got hold of the high ground to their north and some of the buildings, that they'd be in trouble, and they were. And so the Russians are able to effectively push the Ukrainians out of the southwest tip of the urban area, and they're covering the main road, this famous road, the TO504, which is the escape route for the Ukrainians, goes down to Konstantinivka and towards Chasiv Yar, and it's their supply route in and out, and they've more or less got that road covered as well. And there's been some fighting over that road for months now. So that's not really a feasible option for the Ukrainians to keep on using it. It's a bit of a thunder run up and down that road. So the situation is that the Russians have got the urban center, but the Ukrainians have certainly not been surrounded, which was the Russians' original intention, and they are on the outskirts of Bakhmut. So it's true to say that the Ukrainians are not fighting in Bakhmut anymore, but they're fighting for Bakhmut. They're on the outskirts of it, and they've put in two big attacks last week to the north and the south of the city with two assault brigades, one in the north, one in the south. They're about as of last night, they were about 7 kilometers north of Bakhmut and about 5 kilometers south. And so they're fighting around the area, and the Russians are obviously worried enough to bring up some of the reserves about 36 hours ago in case they then got surrounded themselves to the east of Bakhmut. So the battle goes on.
So why do they want it? I mean, there's a risk here, isn't there, for Russia that it becomes very expensive to hold. It becomes a Pyrrhic victory, effectively, that by holding the centre, they just have to pour more and more reserves in, which can't be used elsewhere. Maybe the Ukrainians will find a benefit in their counterattack at some point. But why is it just become a sort of totemic city rather than a strategic city?
Yes, it was never a strategic target. It was totemic because almost a year ago, when the Russian advance had more or less ground to a halt and they weren't doing very well anywhere, the Wagner group, Prigozhin's Wagner group, made it their target to show that they could take a city that other Russian forces couldn't take. Now, in fact, they work a lot with the VDV, which are the Russian airborne forces, and they've been involved as well quite heavily. But nevertheless, this became totemic for, in a sense, the private military company that works for the Kremlin to try to take Bakhmut. And the more they pushed on it and the more the Ukrainians, as it were, resisted, then the more important the city seems to become. But there are no great rail lines, or there's a railway that runs through there, but there's no great communication lines. I mean, the communication hub is the place I mentioned down in the southwest, Konstantinivka. That's more important. It's not on the way to anywhere important. There's the E40 highway that runs northwest of Bakhmut up towards Slavyansk, and that's an important place, Slavyansk. And twice the Russians have tried to push up the E40 and come to grief both times. And if you look at the ground west of Bakhmut, that is between Bakhmut and the places which are strategic, like Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, then that ground is a series of ridges in rising ground. And so they're very easy to defend. Any Russian commander looking westwards from Bakhmut would have real doubts about whether they really want to go that way. I mean, the way into the strategic areas of the Donbass that the Russians don't now control is from the north and the south, not pushing west from Bakhmut. So it's not strategically important. It's just, this happens in warfare. places become important because people fight and die for them.
And just finally, then, where's your level of optimism about this counterattack? It feels like we've been talking about it for ages, and we talked to people who've said at one point, "Oh, this is the year, this is the summer in which the Russians are driven out of Ukraine." We now hear things like, "Well, we have to get the F-16 sorted because the Ukrainians will be fighting in a year, 2 years' time, and so there's long enough to start training up people because this war is going to be an attritional thing that goes on indeterminately." Where do you stand on the state of the war?
Yes, I mean, the Ukrainian offensive will begin pretty soon. I mean, it's already begun in the air, and we can see that from the tempo of air operations, but it won't really begin until the heavy metal starts to move. And we'll see that when the armored units, the Ukrainian armored units, begin to make a big thrust. And they will do that. I think we're only days away from that now, in my view. One could be wrong, of course, but the longer the Ukrainians leave it before starting, the more the Russians will have dug in the areas that the Ukrainians really want to take. So I think we'll see it very soon. And I think they'll do pretty well. But it won't be good enough just to do pretty well. They will have to be decisive. Somehow the Ukrainians have got to conjure out of this offensive, not just military success, but some sense of a decisive shift in the perception of what is going on the battlefield, so that both Ukraine and Russia and the rest of the Western world have a sense that this war could result in the Russians being thrown out of Ukrainian territory in some reasonable time, maybe end of this year, maybe in this time next year, not 5 years' time or 8 years' time, but sometime within the next 18 months or so. If that were the outcome, that people expected that to be a feasible result, then the offensive will be successful. But if it is militarily successful but does not create that sense that this could come to an end in a year or 18 months, then politically it will have failed.
It's a really interesting way of putting it. Michael, great to speak to you as ever. Thank you for joining us. That's Professor Michael Clarke there, the former Director General of RUSI.